The morning they came for the flags, I was standing in my grandmother's kitchen watching her burn letters in the sink. She didn't look up when the trucks rolled past, their engines grinding against the August heat, just kept feeding paper to the flames, one envelope at a time, her fingers steady even as ash drifted across the counter like gray snow. Outside, the neighborhood dogs had gone quiet. That's how I knew something fundamental had shifted, when animals stop making noise, when they choose stillness over their nature. "Don't watch," she said, though she wasn't looking at me. "It'll be worse if you watch." But I did watch. Through the window above the sink, past the geraniums she'd kept alive through 3 droughts, and a husband's death, I watched them move from house to house with their ladders and their clipboards and their practiced efficiency. The Hendersons' flag came down first, then the Kowalskis', then ours. They weren't rough about it. That's what I remember most clearly. They folded each one with the kind of precision you'd use for a funeral, 13 folds that transformed cloth into a tight triangle of stars. They handed them to whoever answered the door, said something brief that looked like an apology from a distance, then moved to the next house. The whole street stripped in under an hour. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. My grandmother finished with the letters and turned on the faucet, washing the ash away in spirals. "Your grandfather brought that flag home from Philadelphia," she said. "Stood in line 6 hours at Independence Hall to buy it. This was back in '68, right after your mother was born. He wanted her to grow up knowing what it meant." She dried her hands on a dish towel, her movements deliberate. "Guess it doesn't mean that anymore." I was 17 that summer, old enough to understand that the world could change while you were looking right at it, young enough to believe it might change back if you wanted it badly enough. The flags were just the beginning, though we didn't know it then. Or maybe we did know, and that's why my grandmother was burning letters, why the Kowalskis had already packed 2 suitcases and put them in their truck, why Mr. Henderson across the street had spent the previous evening in his garage with a shovel digging up something from beneath his workbench and reburying it somewhere else. The official reason came through on the emergency broadcast system that afternoon. I was in my room when the alert went off. That piercing tone that interrupts everything, followed by the carefully modulated voice of someone whose job was to make catastrophe sound reasonable. In accordance with the National Unity Act passed by emergency decree, all displays of regional, national, and historical symbols are temporarily prohibited to facilitate the peaceful transition to a continental governance structure. This is a temporary measure to ensure public safety during a period of unprecedented cooperation between former sovereign entities. Citizens are asked to comply fully and to report any acts of symbolic resistance to local authorities. Temporary. That word hung in the air like smoke. Everything was temporary now. The currency switch had been temporary, the checkpoints were temporary. The curfew was temporary. The way temporary had come to mean forever without actually saying it. That was the real genius of the language they'd developed, the ability to make permanence sound like patience. My phone buzzed. It was Caleb, my best friend since 4th grade, since the day he'd punched Derek Simmons for stealing my lunch and we'd both ended up in the principal's office, bonded by shared injustice. "You seeing this shit?" his text read. "Watching them take ours down now," I typed back. "My dad's losing it. Says he's not giving them his grandfather's flag. Says they'll have to take it from him." I looked out my window. The collection trucks were making second passes now, gathering the folded triangles that had been politely handed over. Most people had given them up without resistance, but 3 houses down, I could see Marcus Chen standing on his porch with his arms crossed, the flag behind him still hanging from its mount. 2 officials were talking to him, their body language patient but firm. "Tell your dad to be smart," I typed. "Not worth it." But even as I sent the message, I wasn't sure I believed it. What was worth it anymore? Where was the line between prudent compliance and complicit surrender? These were the questions adults asked in hushed voices after they thought the kids were asleep. The debates that happened in living rooms with the TV turned up loud enough to cover the conversation. "Where?" My grandmother called me downstairs. When I got to the kitchen, she was sitting at the table with the folded flag in front of her. its triangle of stars somehow smaller than I remembered. "You need to take this somewhere," she said. "Where?" "There's a place. Up past the old quarry near where the hiking trail dead ends at the ridge. You know the spot?" I nodded. Caleb and I had spent half our childhood up there, building forts and pretending we were explorers discovering country no one had seen before. "There's a cave there, more like a crack in the rock face, but it goes back about 15 feet. Your grandfather showed it to me once years ago. Said it was a good place to keep things you didn't want found." She pushed the flag across the table toward me. "Take this up there. Take anything else you think matters. Do it tonight, after dark. Grandma, if they find out, then we'll deal with it. But I'm not letting them have everything, August. I'm not." Her voice caught on my name, the first time I'd heard it waver all day. "Your grandfather fought in a war he didn't believe in because he was told it was his duty. Came home with a piece of shrapnel in his hip that hurt him every day for 40 years. And he never once complained because he thought he was protecting something that mattered. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe it never mattered the way he thought it did. But I'm not letting them take even the memory of what he believed." I took the flag. It was heavier than I expected, all that fabric and meaning condensed into something you could hold in 2 hands. That night I waited until the house was quiet. My grandmother had gone to bed early, exhausted by the weight of the day. I put the flag in my backpack along with a flashlight, a bottle of water, and, on impulse, the photo album from the living room shelf, the one with pictures of my grandfather in his uniform, my grandmother in her wedding dress, my mother as a child, and me at every age, a visual history of continuity that suddenly felt fragile. The streets were empty under the new curfew, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., no exceptions, enforced by patrols that rolled past every 30 minutes with spotlights that swept across yards and windows. I'd timed my departure for the gap between patrols, 10 minutes after one passed, which gave me maybe 20 minutes before the next. The August heat hadn't broken with sunset. It just transformed into something thick and present, the kind of humid darkness that made breathing feel like work. I moved quickly through familiar territory, cutting through the Kowalski's backyard, then along the drainage ditch that ran behind the shopping center where I'd bought comics every Saturday for 5 years, until the store closed and became a cell phone repair place that was never actually open. At the edge of town, where the streetlights gave way to nothing, I started the climb toward the quarry. The trail was overgrown, but still passable, worn into the hillside by decades of kids seeking anywhere that wasn't adult supervision. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Caleb again. "Where are you?" I didn't answer. Bringing him into this felt wrong, spreading the risk. But halfway up the trail I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find him jogging to catch up, his own backpack slung over one shoulder. "Don't tell me not to come," he said, breathing hard. "I saw you leave from my window. Figured you were doing something stupid. Smart thing would be to turn around." "Yeah, well." He adjusted his pack. "My dad's flag is in here. The one he wouldn't give up. They came back for it, 3 of them, and he still wouldn't hand it over. So they took him instead. Said he'd be released after a compliance evaluation at the regional center. My mom started crying and I took the flag and ran. Didn't know where else to go, then I saw you." We stood there in the dark, 2 teenagers with backpacks full of contraband symbolism, and I felt something shift in my understanding of what we were doing. This wasn't just hiding family heirlooms. This was choosing a side in something bigger than both of us, something we barely understood. "Up past the quarry," I said, "there's a cave." We climbed in silence, listening for patrols that never came. The quarry opened up below us like a wound in the earth, 40 years abandoned, filled with dark water that reflected nothing. At the ridge, I found the crack in the rock face exactly where my grandmother had described it, narrow enough you'd miss it if you weren't looking, wide enough to squeeze through sideways. Inside, the darkness was complete. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam caught stone walls that had been shaped by water over millennia, smooth and cold. The cave stretched back farther than my grandmother had said, opening into a small chamber maybe 8 feet across. And we weren't the first ones there. The flashlight beam swept across stacks of boxes, plastic bins, carefully wrapped bundles. Caleb whistled low. "Someone's been using this place." I moved closer. The nearest box had a date written on it in marker, 2 months ago, right after the currency switch. I opened it carefully. Inside were books. Not just any books, but ones I recognized from my history classes, ones that had quietly disappeared from school libraries over the past year. A history of civil resistance, a biography of Frederick Douglass, a collection of Supreme Court dissents, each one carefully wrapped in plastic, preserved against moisture. The next box held newspapers from before the transition, back when there were still multiple newspapers, before consolidation and unified messaging protocols turned the news into something uniform and unthreatening. The one on top had a headline about protests in the Capitol, a story I remembered reading 3 years ago, before protests became classified as public disturbances and stopped being reported at all. Someone's building an archive, Caleb said. He was looking through a box of photographs, images of demonstrations, of people holding signs, of crowds gathered in defiance of something we could only half remember. We added our flags to the collection, placing them carefully in an empty bin along with my photo album, and a letter I wrote quickly in the margin of my notebook. Just my name, the date, and a single line. This mattered to us. Whatever comes next, know that this mattered. As we worked, I became aware of sound deeper in the cave, a kind of echo that suggested the space went back farther than we'd explored. Caleb heard it too. We looked at each other, and without discussing it, moved toward the back of the chamber where another narrow opening revealed itself in the flashlight beam. This passage was tighter, requiring us to crouch, then crawl. It opened after 20 feet into another chamber, this one much larger, and this one was occupied. The flashlight beam caught faces first, pale and startled in the sudden light. Then I recognized them. Sarah Mendoza, who'd been valedictorian 2 years ahead of me. Mr. Chen from down the street, who'd refused to give up his flag. A woman I didn't know. An older man with a beard. Maybe 7 people total, sitting in a circle around a battery-powered lantern, surrounded by more boxes, more archives, more fragments of what was being systematically erased. "Turn that off," Sarah said quietly. "There are sightlines from the quarry rim." I killed the flashlight. In the softer light of the lantern, I could see them more clearly. They didn't look like revolutionaries or resistance fighters. They looked like people who'd been pushed until they found their line and stopped. "We're not trouble," Caleb said. "We just came to hide some things." "We know," the bearded man said. "We've been expecting you. Your grandmother sent word, August. Said you were coming." I felt the ground shift again. That sense of discovering that the world had been changing in ways you hadn't noticed. That conversations had been happening in spaces you didn't know existed. "How do you know my grandmother?" "She's been part of this longer than anyone," Sarah said. "Since before the transition, since back when people still thought voting might fix things. When that stopped being an option, she started finding other ways." "Other ways to do what?" "To remember," the woman I didn't know said. She had an accent I couldn't place, something that suggested migration and long stories. "To preserve, to make sure that what we were doesn't completely disappear into what they want us to become." Mr. Chen stood up, his joints cracking. "The flags were the final provocation," he said. "Everything else, you could rationalize. The economic integration, maybe that made sense. The security protocols, maybe those were necessary. The messaging consolidation, maybe that was just efficiency. But the flags, that was about erasing identity, about making us forget we were ever separate things that chose to be together. They want to remake history so it looks like this was always inevitable, always the plan, but some of us remember when it wasn't." "So what is this?" I asked. "What are you doing here?" "Right now, surviving, preserving." Sarah gestured at the boxes around them. "Every book they ban, we copy. Every record they seal, we store. Every story they try to simplify or erase, we write down exactly as it was. We're building a counter-archive, evidence that there was another version of events, that people resisted, that not everyone agreed." "For what?" Caleb asked. "Who's it for?" "Maybe no one," the bearded man admitted. "Maybe we're just making ourselves feel better. Or maybe someday someone will want to know the truth about what happened here, about how quickly a country can transform into something else when the right pressure is applied in the right ways." We're preserving evidence for a trial that might never happen, witnesses to events that everyone else will be encouraged to forget. I thought about my grandmother burning letters, about Mr. Chen being taken away for refusing compliance, about all the small acts of erasure that had been accumulating like snowfall, each one insignificant until suddenly you were buried. "Can we help?" I asked. The woman with the accent smiled. "You already are. Every person who chooses to remember instead of forget, who keeps something real instead of accepting the replacement, that's help. That's resistance." We stayed for an hour listening to their stories, learning about the network of similar archives being built in caves and attics and false-backed closets across the region. They told us about the Underground Railroad of books, the way banned materials moved from hand to hand through communities that still valued what was being lost. They explained the careful protocols: never tell more than you need to, never gather in the same place twice, never write anything down that could connect people to each other. "The most dangerous thing," Sarah said, "is believing you're alone. That's what they want, isolation. People are much easier to control when they think everyone else has accepted the new reality. But look around." She gestured at the cave, at the archives, at us. "We haven't accepted it. We're just careful." When Caleb and I finally left, threading our way back through the narrow passages and out into the night air, the sky was starting to pale toward dawn. We'd missed the curfew end by 20 minutes, but the patrols had apparently given up for the night. The town below looked peaceful, almost normal, if you didn't know what had been taken from it. "What do we do now?" Caleb asked. "We go home. We act normal. We wait." "Wait for what?" I didn't have an answer. Wait for things to get worse, probably. Wait for the next phase of transition, the next layer of erasure. Wait for the moment when enough people found their line and stopped. Or wait for that moment to never come, for everyone to adapt and forget and accept, for the archives to become historical curiosities, evidence of a resistance that failed. But I was waiting for something else, too, something I couldn't quite articulate. I was waiting to see who I was going to become in all of this, whether I had the courage my grandmother had, the conviction Mr. Chen had shown, the commitment Sarah and the others were demonstrating. At 17, you're supposed to be figuring out your identity through normal means: college applications, first jobs, relationships, mistakes that you get to recover from. We were figuring ours out through tests we hadn't asked for, through choices that felt too large for the people we were. When I got home, my grandmother was making breakfast, the kitchen full of light and the smell of coffee. She didn't ask where I'd been, just put a plate of eggs in front of me and said, "Sarah texted. Said you did well. You've been doing this for years, haven't you? Long before you were born. Your grandfather and we always kept records. He saw things in the war, things that official histories didn't include. He started writing it all down, preserving his letters, keeping his own archive. Said someone needed to remember what really happened, not just what they wanted people to believe happened." She sat down across from me. "He died thinking it was all for nothing, that nobody would care about an old man's memories. But I think he was planting seeds, and now they're growing. What happens if we get caught? Probably nothing good." She said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd mention rain in the forecast. "But August, they're already taking everything. What's left to lose that we haven't lost already? At least this way we go down knowing we tried, knowing we didn't just accept it." I ate my breakfast and thought about flags and letters and photographs, about all the ways people try to mark their presence in the world, to say I was here, this was real, this mattered. And I thought about how easily those marks could be erased by people with ladders and clipboards and carefully worded emergency decrees. School started 2 weeks later. By then the flagpoles had been removed from every building, the metal posts cut off at the base, and patched over with concrete like they'd never existed. The history books had been replaced with new editions that described the transition as a natural evolution of governance in response to unprecedented challenges. The word country had been replaced with administrative region. The concept of sovereignty had been replaced with cooperative management. In my English class, Mrs. Palmer was teaching a unit on revisionist literature. "All history is interpretation," she told us. standing at the front of a room that had once held a flag, a map, and a portrait of founders who could no longer be officially acknowledged. The question isn't whether we revise the past, but who gets to do the revising and why. I caught her eye and saw something there, a flicker of recognition or solidarity. After class, she handed me a book. "This disappeared from the library," she said quietly. "Thought you might want to read it before it's completely gone." It was a novel about memory and resistance, about people trying to preserve truth in a society built on forgetting. Inside the front cover, someone had written a list of names and an address. Sarah Mendoza's name was on the list. So was my grandmother's. That night I made my first trip back to the cave without Caleb, carrying the book and a dozen others I'd collected, offerings to the archive. Sarah was there, along with 3 people I hadn't met before. The collection had grown. There were now audio recordings, oral histories captured from people who remembered when things were different. There were maps showing borders that no longer existed. There were copies of laws that had been repealed and replaced with unified codes. "We need to be smarter about this," one of the new people said. He was older, maybe 50, with the careful manner of someone who'd learned to measure his words. "They're starting to notice. There have been roundups in the eastern districts, people arrested for historical obsession disorder. That's what they're calling it now, treating memory like a disease." "So we stop?" Sarah asked. "No, we adapt. We digitize what we can, create redundant copies, distributed networks. We stop putting everything in one place where one raid could destroy it all." He looked around the cave. "This is romantic, hiding things in rocks like we're in some adventure story. But romance won't protect us when they come with dogs and ground-penetrating radar." We spent the next month learning new skills: encryption, data distribution, secure communication. The cave became just one node in a larger network, a physical backup for digital archives that were scattered across encrypted servers, hidden in metadata, embedded in what looked like innocent files. We became part of something that had no name, no formal structure, no membership list that could be seized. Just individuals connected by shared conviction and careful trust. I learned that my chemistry teacher was part of it, the librarian, the guy who ran the print shop downtown, people who looked completely ordinary, who said the right things in public and kept their real thoughts for private spaces, who had learned to live in 2 worlds at once. The first arrest in our town came in October. Mr. Henderson, the neighbor across the street, was taken in for questioning about suspicious activity and possible unauthorized preservation of historical materials. They searched his house for 6 hours, tore up his garage floor, where he'd buried something that night before the flag collection. They found ammunition, a crime now under the new weapons unification laws, but not the documents he'd actually been hiding, which were already distributed across the network. He was released after 3 days, charged with illegal weapons possession, fined heavily, and placed under surveillance. When he came home, he looked 20 years older. My grandmother brought him soup and sat with him on his porch, not saying much, just being present. That's what community had become: quiet solidarity, the presence of witnesses, the refusal to let people disappear into isolation. Caleb's father wasn't as lucky. His compliance evaluation turned into a 6-month detention when they found, hidden in his truck, pamphlets he'd printed about the transition, historical documents comparing it to other instances of democratic backsliding. They called it incitement to resistance, and sent him to a regional facility where family visits were limited to 1 hour per month, supervised and recorded. Caleb changed after that. The anger that had always been just beneath his surface, the quick temper that got him into fights defending his friends, turned into something colder and more focused. He started talking about active resistance, about doing more than just preserving documents. "What's the point of remembering?" he asked one night in the cave, "if we're not going to do anything about it? We're just sitting here building museums to our own defeat." "Memory is doing something," Sarah insisted. "It's the foundation of everything else. You can't resist what you don't remember. You can't even know you've lost something if you forget it existed." "Pretty words," Caleb said. "My dad's in prison for pretty words." The argument that followed was the first real fracture in our small group. Some people agreed with Caleb, thought we should be more active, more visible, more confrontational. Others argued for patience, for building resources that could sustain a longer struggle. I found myself somewhere in the middle, understanding both positions, committed to neither. The decision was made for us in November. The announcement came on a Tuesday, another emergency broadcast interrupting everything. Effective immediately, all private education materials must be registered with the Department of Educational Unity. This includes books, digital materials, home libraries, and personal collections. Registration is free and mandatory. Failure to comply will result in seizure of materials and possible prosecution for educational obstruction. They gave us 2 weeks. That night the cave was packed. 20 people, maybe more, all trying to figure out how to respond. The regional network sent word: comply publicly, hide what matters, prioritize the most important materials. Lists were made, books ranked by significance, digital files backed up and re-backed up, physical materials divided into what could be lost and what couldn't. My grandmother's house became a processing center. People brought boxes in the dark, and we spent nights cataloging, digitizing, distributing. The most important items went into the network. Others were hidden in creative places. False bottoms in furniture, spaces behind walls, buried in yards. Some were destroyed. The logic being that if they couldn't be saved, at least they wouldn't be used as evidence. I learned what it meant to choose, to hold 2 books and decide which one deserved to survive, which ideas were essential enough to risk preservation. It felt like playing God with culture, and it made me understand how much had already been lost. All the things that no one had thought to save, because they assumed there would always be time, always another copy, always another chance. On the day of the registration deadline, we formed a caravan to the Central Processing Center. Cars and trucks loaded with boxes of approved materials, things we were willing to declare, to have recorded, and potentially confiscated. The line stretched for blocks, families carrying their libraries, their children's books, their inherited collections, surrendering them for inspection, for approval, for the official stamp that said these ideas were acceptable. I watched an old woman cry as they confiscated her husband's medical journals, deemed unnecessary and potentially subversive because they contained case studies on treating political prisoners during previous conflicts. I watched a teacher argue that a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. was essential American history, only to be told that the corrected edition was available for purchase at the approved bookstore. When it was my turn, I handed over 3 boxes of innocuous materials, popular novels, cookbooks, general reference works. The inspector barely looked at them, just scanned the spines, marked my form, and handed me a receipt. These will be returned after review, he said, though everyone knew that after review meant never. What about family photos, I asked. Are those covered under personal education materials? He looked at me with the kind of tired suspicion that suggested he'd heard every attempt at clever questions. Photographs are exempt unless they depict prohibited symbols or activities. Use common sense. Common sense. The phrase hung in the air. What was common sense in a world where remembering your own history could be classified as obstruction, where family photographs might become evidence of symbolic resistance? I took my receipt and left, passing the line of people still waiting, all of us participants in this theater of compliance, pretending that registration was different from confiscation, that temporary meant temporary, that we still had choices. The network adapted. Books became files, became code, became patterns of data scattered across so many points that no single raid could capture them. The cave remained, but it was no longer central. We learned from past resistance movements, from people who'd preserved culture under other regimes, from the long history of humans refusing to let their stories be entirely erased. Winter came, and with it, new restrictions. Travel required permits now. Gatherings of more than 5 people required registration. Internet activity was monitored for patterns of antisocial behavior. The word resistance itself became flagged. triggering automatic reviews of anyone who used it. We adapted our language. Resistance became memory work. Archive became personal collection. Meetings became study groups. We learned to speak in metaphor and implication, to communicate entire concepts with careful glances and subtle inflections. Caleb's father was released in January, but he wasn't the same person who'd been taken. He moved carefully, spoke carefully, didn't make eye contact with anyone he didn't absolutely have to. Whatever had happened during his evaluation had broken something fundamental. He went to work, came home, watched the approved news channels, and said nothing controversial ever again. They didn't torture him, Caleb told me. Nothing we could point to. Just 6 months of conversation, of gentle correction, of being shown evidence that his beliefs were mistaken, his memories false, his understanding of history flawed. They were kind about it, he said, always respectful, just helping him see things more clearly. The phrase, seeing things clearly, became popular. It meant accepting the official narrative, the corrected history, the unified interpretation. People who saw things clearly were rewarded with better jobs, easier permit approvals, lighter surveillance. People who didn't were flagged for additional education, additional help in achieving clarity. My grandmother refused to see things clearly. She was too old, she said, too set in her ways to learn new tricks. They left her alone mostly, wrote her off as a harmless eccentric. But she kept working, kept connecting people, kept the network alive through her kitchen and her phone calls, and her careful management of who knew whom. The thing about being old, she told me one night while we digitized another stack of documents, is that people underestimate you. They think you're irrelevant, that your time has passed. And maybe they're right, but that makes you useful in other ways. I can say things, do things, and they just shake their heads and figure I'm too old to matter. Old people have always been good at resistance for exactly that reason. Spring brought a new phase, reconciliation. The message shifted from security to healing, from necessity to opportunity. We've completed our transition, the broadcasts explained. Now it's time to come together, to embrace our unified future, to let go of divisive attachments to the past. The Reconciliation Initiative offered amnesty to anyone who voluntarily turned in prohibited materials. No questions asked, no consequences, just forgiveness and a fresh start. They showed testimonials of people who'd let go of their historical obsessions and found peace and acceptance. Former resistors talking about how much better life was once they'd stopped fighting. Some people took the deal. The weight of constant vigilance, the fear of being caught, the isolation of hiding, it was too much. They turned in their materials, their archives, their carefully preserved evidence of another time. They held small ceremonies, letting go rituals, burning their past in official furnaces, while witnesses applauded their courage in choosing the future. The network shrank. Every defection was a risk. Someone who knew names, locations, connections. We had to assume everything they knew was now known. We changed meeting places, altered protocols, cut connections. The work became harder, lonelier, more dangerous, but something else happened too. The very act of offering amnesty reminded people that resistance existed. You can't call for surrender if there's nothing to surrender to. The Reconciliation Initiative accidentally advertised that not everyone had accepted the transition, that some people were still holding on. New people reached out. Quietly, carefully, they found ways to contact the network. A note left in a library book. A phrase spoken at just the right moment. A look that lasted a beat too long. The network grew even as it contracted, becoming something more distributed, more resilient, more aware of its own vulnerability. I graduated high school that May. The ceremony had been redesigned to emphasize unity and forward-looking optimism. No valedictorian speech about individual achievement. No recognition of past scholars or historical tradition. Just a collective affirmation of our shared future, our commitment to the unified vision, our gratitude for the stable society we'd inherited. Standing in line in my rented gown, they didn't let us keep them anymore. That was wasteful individualism. I looked at my classmates and wondered which ones were part of the network. Which ones were sitting on hidden materials? Which ones met in caves or attics or basements to remember what we were supposed to forget? I couldn't tell. We'd all learned to wear the same face. My grandmother came to the ceremony alone. My parents had divorced 3 years earlier, casualties of the stress that came with everything changing. My mother had moved east, found work with the new administrative system, embraced the unified vision with the enthusiasm of someone who needed to believe it was all for the better. My father had simply disappeared, gone somewhere the permits didn't track, living off-grid in whatever spaces still existed outside the system. After the ceremony, my grandmother took me to dinner at the same restaurant where we'd celebrated every milestone of my childhood. It was still standing, but it had been optimized, the menu simplified, the decor standardized, the local ownership replaced by regional management. The food was fine. It just didn't taste like anything in particular. Your grandfather would be proud of you, she said over dessert. Not because of the diploma, he never cared much about credentials, but because you've chosen to remember, to hold on. That's harder than it sounds, and it's going to get harder. Why? I asked. Haven't they won? They've changed everything, erased everything. What's left to fight over? The story, she said. That's always what's left. They can change the present and control the future, but the past is always there, always a threat to their version of events. As long as people remember that things were different, that there were choices made, that this wasn't inevitable, as long as that memory exists, their victory is incomplete. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a key and an address. This is a storage unit. I've been renting it for 15 years, paid up through the next 10. Inside are copies of everything: journals, letters, photographs, documents. Every year on your birthday, I've added to it your history, my history, our family's history, things that matter, things that are true, things I don't want forgotten. Grandma, I'm 82 years old, August. I'm not being morbid, I'm being practical. Someone needs to know where this is. Someone needs to be responsible for it after I'm gone. That's you now. I took the key. It was small and ordinary, the kind that fit a million different locks, but it felt heavy with the weight of everything it represented. That summer, I got a job at the regional archives, the official ones. It seemed like irony at first, spending my days cataloging and organizing the approved version of history. But Sarah had suggested it, said having people inside the system was useful, that it taught us how they thought, what they valued, where the gaps were. I learned that history isn't erased all at once. It's edited, refined, optimized. Inconvenient details are removed, contradictions are smoothed over. Complex events are simplified into clear narratives with obvious lessons. It's done by people who genuinely believe they're helping, creating a more coherent and useful past, removing confusion and controversy in favor of clarity. My supervisor was a woman named Patricia, who'd been a professor before the transition. She taught me how to evaluate documents for retention. The question we ask, she explained, is whether this material serves the public good. Does it help people understand themselves as part of a unified whole? Does it promote productive thinking? Or does it confuse, divide, and distract? By those standards, most of history had to go. Letters between founders who disagreed became divisive. Records of protests became examples of disorder. Awkward truths persisted in technical journals that nobody thought to review, and we helped them slip through. Small acts of preservation disguised as clerical errors. The wrong box sent to storage. The misfiled folder that ended up in the retention section instead of disposal. The trick, Patricia told me one day when everyone else had left, is knowing what you can save and what you have to let go. She was part of it, part of the network, working inside the system she was supposed to serve, quietly sabotaging the very project she was paid to complete. And she wasn't alone. We're running a long game, she explained. They think in terms of quarters and years. We think in generations. Let them have their victory now. We're planting evidence that will bloom decades from now, when their confidence makes them careless, when the rigid certainty starts to crack. That fall, the first cracks appeared. It started with something small. A student in the Western District found a box of old newspapers in her grandfather's attic. She posted pictures online before her parents could stop her. images of headlines that contradicted the official timeline. The post was removed within hours, but not before it had been shared, copied, cached in 100 places. The response was immediate and revealing. The official channels denounced the documents as fabrications, obvious forgeries created by enemies of unity. But their very vehemence suggested anxiety. Why respond so strongly to obvious forgeries? Why dedicate an entire broadcast to explaining why these documents couldn't be trusted? More documents started surfacing. Photographs that showed dates and events out of sync with official history. Audio recordings of speeches that said things leaders supposedly never said. Video footage of events that officially never happened. Some were legitimate, pieces of the vast underground archive finding their way to public consciousness. Others were fakes, designed to muddy the waters, making it harder to know what was real. The Department of Historical Accuracy was created to address the problem. Their job was to verify authentic historical materials and expose forgeries. They held public events where they demonstrated how old documents could be faked, how photographs could be manipulated, how memories could be false. They were thorough, professional, convincing, but they also revealed something. They were worried. You don't create entire departments to fight something that doesn't threaten you. The network watched and waited. This wasn't our moment yet. Releasing too much too fast would just trigger a crackdown, a purge, a new phase of control. But the fact that the conversation was happening at all, that people were questioning, doubting, comparing, that was progress. Caleb couldn't wait. His father's break had broken something in him too. But instead of becoming cautious, he became reckless. He started a podcast, distributed through encrypted channels, reading from prohibited documents, interviewing people who remembered the transition. He was good at it, passionate and articulate. People listened. He was arrested in November, charged with historical fraud and conspiracy to distribute false information. The trial was perfunctory. Evidence was presented. Expert witnesses explained how his sources were fabricated. Character witnesses described his troubled state since his father's detention, his inability to accept reality, his retreat into fantasy. He was sentenced to 2 years of corrective rehabilitation, a term that meant intensive re-education, combined with community service. When he emerged, he would see things clearly. That was the promise, the hope, the threat. I visited him once before they transferred him to the facility. We sat in a gray room with a guard watching, unable to speak freely, just looking at each other across a metal table. "Don't give up," he said. The words were quiet but fierce. "Whatever they do to me, whatever I say when I get out, know that right now, in this moment, I still believe. I still remember. They can change what I say, maybe even what I think, but they can't change what was true." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. What do you say to someone who's about to have their mind rewritten? How do you promise to remember them as they were, not as they'll become? "Take care of my mom," he added, "and tell Sarah." He trailed off. He and Sarah had started something in the caves, in the quiet moments between archive work. Nothing formal, nothing declared, just a mutual understanding. "Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't wait." That was the last honest conversation I ever had with him. The person who came back 2 years later had Caleb's face and voice, but not his fire. He spoke carefully about his past mistakes, his confusion, his gratitude for the help he'd received. He got a job at the Department of Historical Accuracy, became a spokesperson for the dangers of historical obsession. He was happy, he said, clearer, at peace. His mother cried the first time she saw him after his release. Not from joy. My grandmother died that winter. She went peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the material fragments of a life fully lived. We found her in the morning, her hands folded across her chest, a small smile on her face, like she'd figured something out right at the end. Going through her things, I found layers of hidden history, false backs in drawers, hollowed-out books, a loose brick in the basement that concealed a metal box full of letters. Her entire house was an archive, every room a repository for memory. The storage unit key led to 3 units, not 1. A lifetime of accumulated evidence that things had been different, that choices had been made, that people had resisted. She documented everything, kept everything, preserved everything she could. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying. At her funeral, people I'd never met came to pay respects. They introduced themselves with careful phrases that identified them as part of the network. Your grandmother helped me find some books once. She was always so good at remembering. She taught me that the past mattered, each one a code, a recognition, an acknowledgement of shared work. Sarah spoke at the service. Margaret was a guardian, she said, not just of her own memories, but of all of ours. She understood that culture isn't something that happens to you. It's something you make and protect and pass on. She taught us that remembering is an active choice, a form of love, a kind of resistance. And she showed us that you can live a full life, a good life, even while refusing to forget what others want erased. I inherited the house and everything hidden within it. The network helped me catalog it all, digitize what could be digitized, distribute what should be distributed, preserve what needed to stay physical. It took months. We found things even I hadn't known about, recordings my grandfather had made before he died, oral histories he'd collected from other veterans, first-hand accounts of events that had been systematically erased from official history. The archive became a living thing, growing and changing, passed from hand to hand, copied and adapted and preserved. We were part of something larger now, a continental network of people doing the same work in countless caves and attics and storage units, building redundant, distributed, resilient repositories of memory against a system dedicated to manage forgetting. Years passed. The restrictions normalized. People adapted. A new generation grew up knowing only the unified system, taught from birth that history before the transition was chaotic and dangerous, that the consolidation was a rescue, that anyone who mourned the past was clinging to dysfunction. They couldn't miss what they'd never known. But some still asked questions. Some noticed contradictions. Some found documents that didn't match what they'd been taught. And when they did, the network was there, waiting, offering not answers but evidence, saying, here's what we preserved, here's what we remember, here's what they don't want you to know. Judge for yourself. The work evolved as technology changed. What started as boxes in caves became encrypted databases, blockchain-verified archives, distributed ledger systems that couldn't be erased by any single authority. We learned from cryptocurrency advocates, from digital activists, from people who'd been fighting information control long before our particular crisis. The network grew beyond borders, connecting with similar movements in other regions facing similar erasures. We shared strategies, technologies, stories. Someone in the eastern districts developed a steganography system that hid entire documents in seemingly innocent image files. Someone in the south created a distributed peer-to-peer network that made censorship nearly impossible. Someone in the north figured out how to use old gaming servers as data repositories, hiding history in places authorities would never think to look. I became a teacher, ironically enough. Not in the official system, but in the informal network of people who wanted their children to learn more than the approved curriculum. We met in basements and back rooms, teaching history that included multiple perspectives, literature that asked difficult questions, civics that explained how systems of power actually worked. It was dangerous work. Every few months someone would be arrested for unauthorized educational activities, but for every person they took, 3 more stepped forward. The hunger for real knowledge, for complicated truth, for history that didn't sanitize itself, it was too strong to suppress completely. I met Elena at one of these underground classes. She was teaching mathematics, showing students how statistical manipulation could be used to lie with numbers, how to spot when data was being selectively presented. Her grandfather had been a statistician before the transition, had watched as methodologies were quietly changed to produce desired results, as inconvenient data was excluded from official reports. We started collaborating, combining our classes, history and mathematics together, showing how numbers told stories, how stories required numbers, how understanding both made you harder to deceive. Our students were hungry for it. this integrated understanding of how truth could be constructed or obscured. Elena and I fell in love slowly, the way people do when they're building something together, when shared purpose becomes shared life. We married in a ceremony that had no official recognition. Marriage had been reformed too, turned into a contract with the state rather than a commitment between individuals. But we gathered our community in someone's backyard, spoke our own vows, created our own meaning. Our daughter was born 2 years later. We named her Margaret, after my grandmother. From the beginning, we had to make impossible choices about what to teach her, what to tell her, how much to burden a child with knowledge that could get her family imprisoned. She needs to know, Elena insisted. Not everything, not all at once, but she needs to know that what she learns in official school isn't the whole story, that there are other versions, other truths, other ways of understanding. She's 5 years old, I countered. She needs to be a kid, to play, to not carry our burdens. She's going to carry them anyway, Elena said. The question is whether she carries them with understanding or without it, whether we prepare her or leave her vulnerable. We compromised. We taught her to think critically, to ask questions, to notice when things didn't make sense. We taught her that adults could be wrong, that official sources could lie, that truth was something you had to work to find. But we didn't give her the archives, didn't make her responsible for preservation, didn't force her into our resistance. She would choose when she was old enough, or she wouldn't. That had to be her decision. The year Margaret turned 7, the system began to crack in visible ways. It started with economic problems. The unified currency, stable for years, began to fluctuate wildly. Official explanations blamed external factors, but people noticed that the timing coincided with revelations about corruption in the central administration. Documents leaked, showing that efficiency gains from consolidation had mostly gone to a small class of administrators and their allies, while ordinary people saw declining purchasing power and reduced services. Then came the infrastructure failures, bridges that hadn't been maintained, power grids that collapsed under ordinary load, water systems that delivered contamination instead of clean water. The unified system had prioritized visible projects and controllable messaging over boring maintenance and distributed resilience. Now the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. The official response was predictable. More control, more restrictions, more messaging about how temporary problems required temporary measures. But something had shifted. People were tired. The promised benefits of consolidation hadn't materialized. The sacrifices demanded kept increasing, and more people were starting to ask why. The network faced a choice. We'd spent years preserving, documenting, waiting. Now there was an opening, a moment when people might actually listen to alternative histories, might actually question the official narrative. But moving too fast could trigger the kind of crackdown that would destroy everything we'd built. Sarah, now in her 40s and running the Continental Coordination, called a meeting. Representatives from every region gathered, not physically, that would be too dangerous, but through encrypted channels, anonymous and secure. We're at an inflection point, she said. We can continue as we have, preserving and waiting, or we can start actively distributing what we've preserved, feeding the growing doubt, accelerating the questioning. Both strategies have risks. The debate lasted hours. Some argued for aggressive distribution, flooding the information space with contradictory evidence, overwhelming the official narrative. Others advocated caution, pointing to historical examples of resistance movements that had been crushed when they moved too soon. Patricia, now retired from the official archives but still active in the network, offered a middle path. We don't flood, she said. We seed. We put evidence where questioners will find it. We create breadcrumbs that lead to larger truths. We let people think they're discovering it themselves, not being told what to believe. It was brilliant strategy. People trust what they discover more than what they're given. If we could create conditions where people stumbled onto archived materials, where their own curiosity led them to contradictory evidence, where their questions naturally connected to our answers, that would be more powerful than any manifesto or broadcast. We implemented what became known as the breadcrumb protocol. In library books, we left marginal notes referencing other sources. In digital files, we embedded metadata pointing to archived materials. In public spaces, we placed QR codes that, when scanned, led to historical documents, each one carefully designed to seem accidental, to reward curiosity rather than demanding attention. The effect was gradual but cumulative. A student researching a paper would find a footnote that led somewhere unexpected. A parent helping their child with homework would discover that the textbook version conflicted with primary sources. An employee digitizing old records would notice discrepancies that official histories didn't explain. Each discovery was small, but each one planted doubt, created questions, made the official narrative a little less certain. And each questioner became a potential network member, someone who might start preserving their own evidence, asking their own questions, refusing their own forms of forgetting. The authorities noticed, of course. The Department of Historical Accuracy increased its activities. New laws criminalized distribution of unauthorized historical materials. Penalties were enhanced for intellectual disruption, but they were playing whack-a-mole. Every source they shut down spawned 3 more. Every person they arrested became a martyr whose story spread through the network. The system had become brittle. Years of enforced uniformity had eliminated redundancy, destroyed local knowledge, centralized everything. It was efficient when it worked, but fragile when stressed. And now it was being stressed from multiple directions: economic problems, infrastructure failures, and growing information resistance. I watched it unfold with mixed feelings. Part of me was excited to see the questioning spread, to see people waking up to alternative possibilities. But part of me was terrified. I had a daughter now. I had more to lose than just my own freedom. Every time I placed a breadcrumb, every time I connected someone to the archives, I was risking her future along with my own. This is why we do it, Elena reminded me during one of my spiral moments. So she grows up in a world where people can ask questions, where history isn't whatever the powerful say it is, where resistance is possible. She was right, but that didn't make it easier. Margaret was 9 when she found my hidden materials. I'd been careful, had protocols, had kept everything locked and encrypted, but she was curious and clever and patient. She found the key, figured out the code, opened the storage boxes in the basement. I found her reading old newspapers, the ones from before the transition. She looked up when I came down the stairs, and I saw knowledge in her eyes that I'd hoped to delay a few more years. "These say different things than my textbooks," she said. "Which ones are true?" I sat down next to her on the cold basement floor. "Both are true in different ways. Your textbooks tell you what people in power want you to believe. These newspapers tell you what people at the time thought was happening. Neither is perfect. Both are partial. Truth is usually somewhere in the complicated middle. Why do we hide these if they're true? Because some truths are dangerous. Because knowing them can get you in trouble. Because the people who run things don't want everyone to know that the world used to be different, that choices were made, that things could have gone another way." She processed this with the seriousness of someone older than her years. "Are you part of something secret?" I had to decide right then how much trust to extend, how much burden to share. She was 9 years old. She was also my daughter, Elena's daughter, Margaret's great-granddaughter. She came from a line of people who'd chosen remembering over forgetting. "Yes," I said. "I'm part of a network of people who preserve real history, who keep evidence of how things actually were, who refuse to let the past be completely erased and rewritten. It's dangerous work. It's important work. And someday, if you want, you can be part of it too. But that's your choice, not mine. You don't inherit this obligation just because you're my daughter. What happens if people find out? Probably prison, re-education, having you taken away from us. Maybe worse." I didn't sugarcoat it. She deserved honesty. She thought about this for a long time, her fingers tracing the headlines on yellowed newspaper. "I want to help," she said finally. "Not with everything. I'm not ready for everything. But I want to help." And so, at 9 years old, my daughter joined the resistance. Not as a full member, not with access to everything, but as someone who understood what we were doing and why. Elena and I taught her tradecraft, how to spot surveillance, how to communicate securely, how to recognize who could be trusted. But we also tried to preserve her childhood, to let her play and dream, and not carry too much weight too soon. It was a balance we never quite achieved. How do you let a child be a child, while preparing them for a world that might demand more than childhood allows? The following spring brought what historians would later call the documentation crisis. A massive data leak from the Department of Historical Accuracy revealed internal communications showing that officials knew their public pronouncements about forgery and fabrication were false. They had authenticated materials showing the transition had been more coercive, more violent, more deliberately manipulative than official histories acknowledged. But they'd hidden these materials, declared them forgeries, prosecuted people for sharing what they knew to be truth. The leak spread faster than they could contain it. Within days, millions of people had copies. The official response was to claim the leak itself was forged. But too many people recognized the authentication markers, knew the internal systems, could verify that these documents were genuine. For 2 weeks it felt like everything might change. Protests erupted in major cities. People demanded answers, accountability, the release of sealed historical records. The network fed the momentum, carefully releasing archive materials that corroborated the leaked documents, that showed patterns of deception and manipulation. But then came the crackdown. It was swift and comprehensive. Emergency powers were invoked, protest leaders were arrested, internet access was severely restricted, new surveillance systems were deployed, and a massive propaganda campaign began, not denying the leaked documents, but reframing them as evidence of hard choices made by people trying to prevent chaos, of pragmatic decisions that had ultimately served the public good. Yes, the transition was more difficult than we've acknowledged, the official statement read. Yes, there was resistance that had to be managed. Yes, we've simplified some histories to promote unity and healing. But consider the alternative. Consider the chaos and division that would have resulted from fully transparent governance during crisis. Sometimes leaders must make hard choices, must balance truth against stability, must prioritize the collective good over individual grievances. It was brilliant rhetoric, acknowledging enough to seem honest while reframing everything to maintain the basic narrative. And it worked, at least partially. Some people accepted the explanation. Others remained skeptical but exhausted, unwilling to sustain resistance in the face of renewed repression. The protests faded. The internet restrictions became permanent. The emergency powers never expired. The network took heavy losses. Dozens of prominent members were arrested in coordinated raids. Server farms were seized. Physical archives were destroyed. Years of work seemed to evaporate in weeks of concentrated attack. But the distributed nature of our system saved us. Every destroyed archive had backups. Every arrested member had only partial knowledge. Every seized server was one node in a larger network. We were hurt, diminished, but not destroyed. And something else happened. The very fact of the crackdown, the severity of the response, convinced many people that there was something real to hide. You don't deploy that much force against fantasy. The official narrative had revealed its own weakness through the strength of its defense. The network rebuilt quietly over the following years, incorporating lessons from the crisis. We became more distributed, more encrypted, more careful about who knew what. We developed new protocols, new technologies, new strategies for preservation in the face of determined opposition. I'm older now, the age my grandmother was when the flags came down. My hair has gone gray. Margaret is grown, has children of her own, has taken over many of the responsibilities I once carried. The world is different than it was when I was 17, but not as different as they'd hoped to make it. The official history still dominates. Most people still learn the sanitized version of events. The unified system still operates, still maintains its control, still enforces its narrative. But underneath, in networks and archives and whispered conversations, other histories persist. Other memories survive. Other stories continue. We didn't win exactly, but we didn't lose either. We held the line. We preserved what they wanted erased. We kept alive the possibility that truth could be more complex than authority allows. that history could be questioned, that memory could be an act of resistance. My granddaughter asks me sometimes about the flags, about the day they came down. She's never seen one flying, has only encountered them in archived photographs, historical documents, hidden collections. To her, they're artifacts of a lost world, symbols of something she can barely imagine. But I tell her the stories anyway, about her great-great-grandmother burning letters in the sink, about the cave past the old quarry, about the network of people who refuse to forget, about the long work of preservation against systematic erasure. Will we ever get them back? She asks. The flags? The old way of things? I don't know how to answer. The past is gone. What was lost can't be fully recovered. But that doesn't mean the work was pointless. Maybe not the flags themselves, I tell her. Maybe not exactly how things were, but the principle behind them, the idea that people can choose their symbols, tell their own stories, preserve their own memories against outside control, that's worth keeping alive. That's what we're actually preserving. Not objects or even specific histories, but the possibility that history could be otherwise. That what exists now isn't the only way things could be. She nods, processing this with the seriousness that seems to run in our family. So we keep the archives, we keep remembering, we keep passing it on. We do, I confirm. For as long as it takes, for as long as anyone's willing to listen, we keep the testimony alive. The work continues. The archive grows. The network adapts and persists. We remember, and we pass it on. The day they buried the flags, they thought they were ending something. But what they actually did was begin something else entirely. A long conversation between past and future, conducted through present resistance. A testimony that refuses to be silenced, evidence that insists on existing, memory that won't accept erasure. I'm an old man now, sitting in my grandmother's kitchen, looking out at the same view she watched the morning the trucks came. The geraniums are still here, descendants of the ones she kept alive through everything. Some things persist. Some lines remain unbroken. My granddaughter is in the basement, cataloging new materials, digitizing old photographs, maintaining the archives that stretch back generations now. She's part of something larger than herself, larger than any of us, a network of memory spanning continents and decades, connecting people who never meet but share a commitment to preservation, to testimony, to the long work of keeping truth alive against those who'd prefer convenient lies. Outside, the world continues. Official history marches forward, confident and controlled. But underneath, in caves and attics and encrypted servers, other histories wait. Patient, persistent, ready for whenever the moment comes that people are ready to listen again, ready to question again, ready to remember again. That moment will come. It always does. Power makes itself brittle through its own rigidity. Control creates the conditions for its own resistance. Enforced forgetting generates desperate memory. We'll be ready when it comes. The archives will be there. The testimony will be available. The evidence will exist. Because some of us buried the flags instead of surrendering them. Some of us chose remembering over forgetting. Some of us insisted that what happened mattered, that how we got here mattered, that the official story wasn't the only story. The work continues. The archive grows, we remember. But memory alone isn't enough. I learned that the hard way. It was 3 years after the documentation crisis, 5 years after my grandmother died, 7 years into my marriage with Elena. Margaret was 12, old enough to understand consequences, young enough to still believe in possibilities. We'd settled into a rhythm, a sustainable pattern of preservation that felt almost normal. We had our jobs, our family, our hidden work. We'd learned to compartmentalize, to keep the different parts of our lives separate. Then they came for the teachers. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just quiet notifications that certain educators were being reassigned for curriculum alignment review. Patricia was among the first. Her decades of subtle sabotage in the official archives had finally caught someone's attention. Not enough evidence for prosecution, but enough suspicion for removal. They offered her a choice. retirement with full benefits if she agreed to a non-disclosure agreement about her work, or continued employment pending a thorough investigation that would likely find reasons for criminal charges. She took the retirement. She was 70 years old, had fought long enough, but she came to see me before she left. One last meeting in a coffee shop that wasn't too surveilled, speaking in the careful code we'd all perfected. "They're getting smarter," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with hands that shook slightly now. "They're not looking for smoking guns anymore. They're looking for patterns, statistical anomalies in what survives and what doesn't. They've built algorithms that flag unlikely preservation rates. They know someone's been manipulating the archives. They just don't know who yet. How long before they figure it out? Months, maybe a year. They'll work backwards, analyze decision patterns, cross-reference with personnel records. Anyone who's been doing what I've been doing will eventually show up in their models." She looked at me directly. "That includes the people you work with. The network inside the system. They're compromised. They just don't know it yet. We spent the next month trying to warn people, trying to create cover stories, trying to manufacture alternative explanations for the patterns that would hold up under scrutiny. But it was like trying to hide footprints in snow that was still falling. Every cover-up created new patterns, new anomalies, new reasons for suspicion. The arrests started in November. Not Patricia, she was protected by her retirement deal, but 3 of her colleagues, 2 people from my archives and a dozen others across the regional network, all charged with systematic corruption of historical materials and conspiracy to distribute unauthorized narratives. The trials were public this time, designed to send a message. Each defendant was presented not as a political prisoner, but as a professional who'd violated their trust, who'd used their position to push personal biases instead of serving the public good. The evidence was careful, thorough, demonstrating clear patterns of preferential preservation, of hidden materials, of connections to unauthorized distribution networks. I watched from the public gallery as people I'd worked with for years were methodically destroyed, their careers ended, their reputations demolished, their families devastated, and the message was clear. This is what happens when you manipulate the system, when you think you're smarter than the authorities, when you try to preserve what should be forgotten. 3 got prison time. The others got probation, massive fines, permanent surveillance, and the kind of public shaming that makes normal life impossible. Their names were on lists now, markers of untrustworthiness, warnings to anyone who might consider similar paths. The network fractured. People who'd been brave became cautious. People who'd been cautious disappeared entirely. The careful systems we'd built over years crumbled in months, not destroyed. The distributed nature still protected the archives themselves, but scattered, disconnected, afraid to reconsolidate. Elena and I had a terrible fight about what to do next. "We have to think about Margaret," she insisted. We were in our bedroom speaking in whispers even though we'd checked for surveillance devices that afternoon. "We have a child. We can't keep risking everything. If we stop now, everything they went to prison for was wasted," I countered. "All that sacrifice, for nothing." Their sacrifice was their choice. Margaret didn't choose this. She deserves parents who aren't in prison, a childhood that isn't destroyed by our commitments. She deserves a world where history isn't completely controlled by authorities, where people can know truth, where memory isn't a crime. She deserves a world where her parents are free. Elena's whisper cracked into something louder. We both froze, listening. But there was no sound of Margaret stirring in her room down the hall. "You're right," I said finally. "You're completely right. But I don't know how to stop. This is who I am now. This is who my grandmother made me, who my grandfather made me. How do I just walk away? The same way Patricia did, the same way thousands of others have. You accept that you did what you could, you preserved what you preserved, and you let someone else carry it forward. You don't have to be the hero of this story, August. You can just be a father, a husband, a person who tried and who survives. We compromised, as married people do. I would distance myself from active network operations. I would maintain the archives I was personally responsible for, but would stop taking on new preservation projects. I would teach Margaret what she needed to know and then let her choose, when she was older, whether to continue the work. It felt like surrender. It felt like exactly the kind of exhausted acceptance that the system counted on, the slow grinding down of resistance into compliance. But Elena was right. We had a child. We had responsibilities that went beyond our political commitments. I told Sarah about my decision during an encrypted call. Her face on the screen was understanding but sad. "You're not the first," she said. "Won't be the last. This work burns people out. It demands more than most people can sustain. Your grandmother was exceptional. You don't have to be exceptional, August. You can just be good enough for as long as you can be." Is that enough? Being good enough? It has to be, because the alternative is burning out completely, and then you're no good to anyone. She paused. Keep the personal archives safe, keep teaching Margaret, and if there's ever a moment when you can safely do more, the network will still be here. We adapt, we survive. I stepped back from the network for 2 years. I kept my job at the archives, but I played it safe, made no suspicious preservation choices, followed every protocol exactly as written. At home, I maintained my grandmother's materials and my own, but I didn't take on new storage responsibilities. I taught Margaret about history and critical thinking, but I didn't bring her deeper into the network. It was a peaceful 2 years in its way. I slept better. I worried less. I was present for Elena and Margaret in ways I hadn't been when I was constantly managing preservation projects and network communications. I remembered what it was like to just be a person, not a resistance fighter. But I also felt hollow, like I'd abandoned something essential, like I was one of those people in historical accounts who chose safety over principle, who looked away when they should have looked closer, who survived but at the cost of everything that made survival meaningful. Margaret noticed. "You're sad a lot now," she said one evening when we were washing dishes together. She was 14, observant and direct in the way teenagers can be. "Not sad exactly," I said, "just contemplating choices. About the archive work, about stopping." I looked at her, surprised. We'd been careful not to discuss my decisions explicitly, not to burden her with adult compromises. "Mom tells me things," she said, catching my expression. "Not everything, but enough, and I have eyes. I can see you're not doing what you used to do, and I can see it bothers you. It's complicated. Sometimes the responsible thing means not doing what you want to do. Sometimes you have to choose between different kinds of duty. Or sometimes," she said carefully, "you're just scared, and that's okay. Being scared doesn't mean you made the wrong choice." Out of the mouths of children. 14 years old, and she saw through all my rationalization to the truth beneath. Yes, I was scared. Scared of prison. Scared of losing my family. Scared of the cost of continued commitment. Fear had been dressed up as responsibility, as maturity, as prudent parenting. But it was still fear. "You're right," I admitted. "I'm scared, terrified actually. That's okay," she said again. "Fear is useful. It keeps you alive. But you taught me that sometimes you have to be scared and do the thing anyway. That courage isn't not being afraid. It's acting despite fear." "When did you get so wise?" "I had good teachers." She finished rinsing a plate and handed it to me for drying. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know. What do you think I should do?" She considered this seriously, her face scrunching up in concentration, the way it had when she was small and working through difficult problems. "I think you should do what feels true, not what feels safe or responsible or smart, what feels true. Because otherwise you're going to be sad and hollow for the rest of your life, and that doesn't help me or Mom or anyone." That night, Elena and I talked for hours, really talked. Not just about practical considerations, but about meaning and purpose and what kind of life we wanted to live, what kind of example we wanted to set. "I don't want Margaret growing up thinking that the right response to threat is always surrender," I told her. "I don't want her to learn that safety matters more than principle." "I don't want her growing up without a father," Elena countered. "I don't want to visit you in prison, to watch you come back broken like Caleb and his father. So we're stuck between impossible choices. No, Elena took my hand. We're choosing between difficult options. That's different. Impossible means no good choice exists. Difficult means every choice has costs, and we have to decide which costs we can live with. What costs can you live with? She was quiet for a long time. I can live with risk, she said finally. I can live with uncertainty. What I can't live with is watching you disappear while still being physically present. These last 2 years you've been safe, but you've also been absent in ways that have nothing to do with physical location. I'd rather have the version of you that's engaged and purposeful, and sometimes scared, than the version that's shut down to avoid pain. That means accepting that I might get caught, that they might take me away. I know, and it terrifies me. But Margaret was right earlier. Courage isn't the absence of fear, and love isn't keeping someone safe from everything. Sometimes love means supporting someone's dangerous commitments because you know those commitments are what makes them who they are. So I went back to the work. Not recklessly, not stupidly, but deliberately, with eyes open to the costs and Elena's support and Margaret's understanding. The network had evolved in my absence. After the crackdown, people had gotten smarter about compartmentalization. The distributed system became even more distributed. Individual nodes had minimal knowledge of the overall structure. Communications were more encrypted, more carefully timed, more conscious of statistical patterns that might flag attention. Sarah greeted my return with careful warmth. "We've missed your work," she said. "But more importantly, are you back because you want to be or because you feel you should be? Because duty-driven commitment burns out fast." "Both, maybe," I said. "I want to be doing this, but I also think I should be. Does it matter which weighs more? As long as both are true, probably not." She brought me up to speed on current operations. The network had shifted strategy after the trials. Less focus on internal system manipulation. That had been compromised. More focus on external distribution, on making archived materials accessible to people who were ready to question but didn't know where to look. "We're building what we're calling discovery paths," she explained. "Sequences of information that lead people from sanctioned sources to questioned sources to archived sources. We let them think they're doing independent research, following their own curiosity, but we're actually guiding them, creating trails that make questioning feel natural rather than rebellious." It was brilliant psychology. People resist being told what to think but embrace conclusions they believe they reached independently. By creating the conditions for self-directed discovery, we could introduce people to archived materials in ways that felt like personal revelation rather than political indoctrination. My role became creating these paths, using my position in the archives to leave subtle inconsistencies in official materials, nothing obvious enough to flag automatic review, but enough to make careful readers pause. A footnote that referenced a document that didn't exist in official collections. A date that didn't quite align with the sanctioned timeline. A quotation attributed to a source that said slightly different things elsewhere. Each inconsistency was a hook, a tiny doubt, an invitation to dig deeper. And for those who did dig deeper, we'd arrange for them to find progressively more complex materials. Paths that led from sanctioned sources to tolerated sources to prohibited sources, each step feeling like natural progression rather than radical shift. It worked slowly. This wasn't mass conversion, wasn't revolutionary awakening, just gradual erosion of certainty, slow accumulation of questions, patient building of doubt. Over months and years, we watched as more people started asking uncomfortable questions, noticing patterns in official narratives, seeking alternative sources. The authorities noticed too, of course. They responded with another wave of controls, another tightening of information access. But they were fighting a different kind of battle now. You can restrict information flow, but you can't eliminate human curiosity. You can punish questioning, but punishment itself raises questions. Every crackdown suggested there was something worth cracking down on. Margaret joined the work officially when she was 16. Not because we pushed her, but because she asked. She'd been watching, learning, thinking, and she'd decided that this mattered, that she wanted to be part of it, that she could live with the risks. I understand the costs, she said when Elena and I tried to talk her through the decision one more time. I know people go to prison. I know families get destroyed. I know this isn't safe or easy or probably even smart. But this is who we are. This is what our family does. And I don't want to be the generation that stops, that decides comfort matters more than memory. She was 17 when she created what became known as the Student Documentation Project. It started simply, encouraging her classmates to interview grandparents and elderly relatives about their memories of the transition. Official school policy encouraged such projects. Oral history was sanctioned as long as it aligned with approved narratives. But Margaret and a growing network of students asked different questions. Not, how did the transition improve things, but, what do you remember changing? Not, why was unity necessary, but, what did you lose? The resulting interviews were ostensibly for school projects, but copies found their way into the network archives. Hundreds of personal testimonies from people who remembered the before times. The project spread to other schools, other regions. Students interviewing grandparents became a minor trend, sanctioned by authorities who saw it as intergenerational connection building. They didn't realize until too late that they were facilitating mass documentation of unauthorized memories, that students were preserving testimonies that contradicted official timelines. By the time authorities tried to shut it down, thousands of interviews had been recorded. They issued new guidelines about oral history projects, requiring official supervision and approved question lists. But the damage, from their perspective, was done. The testimonies existed, were backed up, distributed, preserved. Margaret was questioned twice about her role. Both times she played innocent, just a student doing a school project, just trying to connect with her grandmother's generation, no political intent whatsoever. She was smart enough not to have obvious connections to the network, careful enough not to leave traceable evidence. They suspected but couldn't prove. You're good at this, Sarah told her after the second questioning. Too good, maybe. You're getting attention. That's dangerous. I'm a teenager doing school projects, Margaret replied. What are they going to do, arrest me for homework? That would raise more questions than it would answer. She was right. But it didn't stop Elena and me from worrying. We'd raised her in this work, taught her these skills, encouraged her critical thinking. Now we had to live with the consequences of our own parenting, watching our child take risks we'd have preferred she avoid. The years accumulated. Margaret graduated high school, went to university, studied history and computer science. She brought both skills to the network, helping modernize our preservation methods, creating better encryption, building more resilient systems. Caleb remained a cautionary tale. He'd become a minor celebrity in the Department of Historical Accuracy, a reformed radical who now helped identify and counter historical manipulation. He gave speeches about his journey from confusion to clarity, about how he'd been seduced by conspiracy theories and alternative narratives, about how grateful he was for the intervention that had helped him see truth. I saw him once at a public event. He was speaking to a crowd of young people, warning them about the dangers of unauthorized historical sources, explaining how easily intelligent people could be manipulated by appealing fictions. He seemed earnest, committed, completely transformed. Afterward I approached him, curious if anything of my old friend remained. August, he said, his smile practiced and empty. It's been too long. We made small talk for a few minutes, surface-level pleasantries. Then as we were parting, he leaned in slightly and said very quietly, "They're watching. They're always watching. Be careful." I wasn't sure if it was a warning or a threat. Maybe both. Maybe the person he'd become wasn't entirely sure either. The decades passed. I reached my 50s, then my 60s. Elena and I celebrated 30 years of marriage. Margaret got married herself, to another network member, someone who understood the work and its costs. They gave us grandchildren, twins, a boy and a girl. The world changed around us in small ways and large. The unified system persisted, evolved, adapted. Each generation born into it found it more normal, less questioned. The transition receded from living memory into history, from history into myth. Fewer people remembered the before times. Fewer cared about flags or sovereignty or the questions that had once seemed urgent. But the network persisted too, smaller than it had been, more careful, but still present, still preserving, still documenting, still passing on the knowledge that things had been different, that choices had been made, that the official story wasn't the complete story. My granddaughter, also named Margaret, carrying forward the family tradition, was 7 when she asked me the same question her mother had asked at her age. "What are these?" She'd found papers in a drawer, old photographs of flags and parades and celebrations that made no sense to her world. I told her the story again. About the morning the trucks came, about my grandmother burning letters, about the cave and the archives, and the long work of preservation, about choosing to remember when forgetting would have been easier. "Will it ever change back?" she asked. "I don't know," I told her honestly. "Maybe not. Maybe the world we lost is gone forever. But that doesn't mean preserving memory of it is pointless. Even if we never restore what was, even if the unified system lasts 1,000 years, someone should remember that it wasn't always this way. Someone should keep the record that this was chosen, not inevitable. That people resisted, that some of us refused to forget." "Is that enough?" she asked. "Just remembering." I thought about my grandmother, about Patricia, about all the people who'd gone to prison, or been broken, or had sacrificed everything to preserve evidence of alternative possibilities. I thought about Margaret, my daughter, risking herself to document unauthorized testimonies. I thought about Elena supporting dangerous work because she loved the person doing it. I thought about decades of patient preservation, of small acts of resistance, of refusing to surrender memory even when everything else had been surrendered. "I don't know if it's enough," I said finally, "but it's what we can do. It's what we have done. And maybe someday when people are ready to question again, when the system's confidence makes it careless, when new contradictions emerge, maybe then someone will want this evidence. We'll need these archives. We'll be grateful that some stubborn people refuse to let everything be forgotten." "What if no one ever wants it?" she asked. "What if we just preserve and no one ever cares?" "Then we preserved it anyway." I pulled her close, this small girl who carried forward a tradition of resistance she barely understood. "Then we lived lives that meant something to us, even if they didn't change the world. Then we were people who chose memory over forgetting, who valued truth over convenience, who held on to difficult knowledge because someone needed to. That matters, even if only to us." She nodded against my chest, and I felt the weight of generations, the grandmother who'd taught me, the daughter I'd taught, the granddaughter I was teaching now. An unbroken chain of memory, of testimony, of refusal to accept official versions as complete versions. The work continues. The archives grow. The network persists. I'm old now. My hands shake like Patricia's did. My memory sometimes falters, but the storage units remain. Multiple units now, filled with decades of accumulated evidence. The cave past the old quarry still holds its boxes and files. The digital archives stretch across countless nodes, distributed and redundant and persistent. Margaret, my daughter, now in her 40s, runs the Continental Network now, the role Sarah once held. My granddaughter is learning the skills she'll need to continue the work. The chain remains unbroken. Sometimes I wonder if we're deluding ourselves, if we're just old people clinging to grievances, preserving evidence for trials that will never happen, maintaining archives no one will ever want, if we should just accept reality, acknowledge defeat, stop fighting battles that were lost decades ago. But then I remember something my grandmother told me that morning in the kitchen, while we watched the flags come down. She said that my grandfather had died thinking his work was for nothing, that nobody would care about an old man's memories, but his preservation had mattered. His careful documentation had seeded everything that came after. He died too soon to see the fruit of his labor, but that didn't mean the labor had been pointless. Maybe we're all planting seeds we won't live to see bloom. Maybe that's what resistance always is, stubborn faith that someone, sometime will care about what we preserved. That truth has value even when it has no immediate use. That memory matters even when it seems to change nothing. The day they buried the flags, they thought they were burying history, but history doesn't stay buried. It persists in documents and testimonies and photographs, in archives hidden in caves and storage units and encrypted servers, in families that pass down stories and skills and stubborn commitments to truth. They buried the flags. We buried them too in different ways for different reasons, but we also mapped where they were buried, documented how they got there, preserved evidence of what they meant, so that someday someone could find them again, could dig them up, could remember. The work continues. The archive grows. We remember, and we pass it on. For now, for always, for whoever comes next and wants to know what really happened here, how we got from there to here, what was lost and what was kept, and who refused to let it all disappear. This is our testimony. This is our archive. This is the story of the day we buried the flags and everything that came after. May it find whoever needs it, whenever they need it. May it tell them what they need to know. May it remind them that resistance is possible, that memory can survive, that truth persists even when power tries to erase it. This is what we preserved. This is why we preserved it. This is who we were when everything was being taken, when everyone was being changed, when the world was transforming into something else. We were the ones who remembered. We were the ones who refused. We were the ones who kept the flags hidden but not destroyed, waiting for a future that might want them back. This is our story. This is our witness. This is our testimony to what was lost, to what we tried to save. May it be enough. But enough is a shifting target. I learned that when the second generation of resistance emerged, not people like me who remembered the transition, but their children and grandchildren who knew only the unified system and chose to question it anyway. They called themselves the inheritors, not as an official name. Nothing about the network was ever official, but as a loose identifier, a way of acknowledging that they'd inherited both the work and the burden from those who came before. My grandson Thomas became one of their leaders. He was 23, brilliant with technology in ways I could barely comprehend, impatient with the caution that had characterized our generation's approach. He looked at what we'd built, the careful archives, the patient preservation, the quiet resistance, and saw it as necessary but insufficient. You preserve the evidence, he told me during a family dinner that turned into an argument. That's important, but what's the point of evidence if no one ever sees it, if it just sits in storage units and encrypted servers, waiting for some magical moment that never comes? The point is that it exists, I countered, that when the moment does come, grandfather, it's been 40 years, 2 generations. The moment you're waiting for might never arrive, or it might come and go and we'll miss it because we're too busy being careful, too invested in preservation to actually use what we've preserved. Elena put her hand on mine under the table, a gesture that said, "Let him speak. Let this generation have their say." So I listened. "We want to do something different," Thomas continued, glancing at the other young people around the table, his sister Sarah, Margaret's twins, half a dozen others from network families. Not reckless, not stupid, but more active. We want to start actually distributing the archives, not just waiting for people to stumble across breadcrumbs. We want to flood the information space with so much contradictory evidence that the official narrative can't contain it all. That's what got people arrested before, I said. That's what broke Caleb, sent Patricia into retirement, destroyed dozens of lives. I know. We've studied that history. But the situation is different now. The internet is more distributed. Encryption is better. We have tools you didn't have, methods for distribution that are harder to track and shut down. And most importantly, there are more of us. Not just us in this room, but thousands across the continent, all children of network families, all raised with the skills and knowledge to do this work. You're talking about a fundamental shift in strategy, Margaret said. My daughter, not my granddaughter. From preservation to distribution, from defense to offense. Exactly, Sarah said. She was Thomas's younger sister, quieter but no less committed. We think preservation worked for its time. You saved things that would have been lost. You built the infrastructure we need. But now it's time to actually use that infrastructure, to move from hiding evidence to sharing it, from protecting memory to activating it. The debate lasted deep into the night. The older generation, me, Elena, Margaret, others from the original network, argued for caution, for recognizing patterns, for learning from past failures. The inheritors argued for momentum, for seizing moments, for understanding that perfect safety meant perfect stagnation. In the end, we couldn't stop them, even if we wanted to. They had access to the archives. They had the skills. They had their own networks and methods. The most we could do was offer advice, share warnings, and hope they learned from our mistakes without having to repeat them all. The cascade, as it came to be called, started small. A few documents posted anonymously to open forums, historical photographs that contradicted official timelines, audio recordings of speeches that said things leaders supposedly never said. Nothing that seemed coordinated at first, just random pieces of evidence appearing in different places, uploaded by different accounts, shared through different channels. The authorities responded predictably, declaring them forgeries, scrubbing them from official platforms, arresting a few careless distributors. But for every piece removed, 3 more appeared. For every account shut down, 5 new ones emerged. The inheritors had learned from previous crackdowns, had built systems designed for resilience rather than efficiency, for persistence rather than perfection. Within 6 months, the information landscape had changed. You couldn't browse any social platform without encountering alternative histories, contradictory evidence, questions about official narratives. Teachers found students bringing archived documents to class, asking why their textbooks said different things. Parents discovered their children knew histories they'd never been taught, had seen photographs of a world they'd been told never existed. The authorities escalated their response. New laws criminalized not just distribution, but possession of unauthorized historical materials. Penalties were enhanced. Surveillance was intensified. The Department of Historical Accuracy tripled its staff and budget. But they were fighting a different kind of battle now, one they weren't equipped to win. You can't put information back once it's out. You can't make people unsee what they've seen, unknow what they've learned. Every attempt at suppression just validated the importance of what was being suppressed. The first cracks in the official narrative appeared not from the distribution itself, but from the response to it. A junior official in the Historical Accuracy Department leaked internal communications showing that the department knew much of the forged material was actually authentic. They were declaring real documents fake because the truth was incompatible with official history. That leak, authenticated, verified, undeniable, changed everything. It wasn't just resistance groups saying the authorities lied. It was the authorities' own documents proving it. Protests erupted, not like the brief flare-up after the documentation crisis decades earlier, but sustained, growing, spreading. People demanded access to sealed archives. They wanted accountability for decades of deception. They wanted the truth, however complicated or uncomfortable. The response was swift and brutal. Emergency powers, mass arrests, internet shutdowns, curfews. But this time, the resistance had infrastructure, the network that had spent decades building resilience, that had prepared for exactly this kind of crackdown, activated in full. Underground newspapers appeared, printed on hidden presses and distributed hand to hand. Mesh networks provided internet access independent of official controls. Safe houses sheltered protesters. Supply chains kept communities fed during shutdowns. All the skills and systems developed for preserving history were repurposed for sustaining resistance. Thomas was arrested 3 weeks into the protests. They'd tracked him through his distributions, built a case, waited for the right moment. Sarah went underground, coordinating operations from hidden locations. The twins, my granddaughter Margaret's children, took over technical operations, keeping the networks running. I visited Thomas in detention. He looked tired but unbroken, unlike Caleb all those years ago. The system had evolved, but so had resistance. They could imprison bodies, but they couldn't imprison the ideas that had already spread, the evidence that had already been seen. Was it worth it? I asked him through the reinforced glass. Ask me in 10 years, he said. Ask me after we see if this actually changes anything. But grandfather, we had to try. You spent your life preserving. That mattered. But at some point, someone had to actually use what you preserved. Otherwise, it's just museum work, cataloging a dead past instead of informing a living present. The trial was political theater designed to demonstrate the cost of resistance. But it backfired. Thomas used his testimony to present archived evidence. Yes, he'd distributed unauthorized materials. Yes, he'd coordinated with resistance networks. But look at what he'd distributed. Actual historical documents, real photographs, authentic testimonies. The crime was telling the truth. The prosecution tried to argue that truth wasn't the point, that social stability required managed information, that individual access to unfiltered history served no public good. But in making that argument, they revealed the heart of the system. Control mattered more than truth, stability more than accuracy, managed perception more than reality. Thomas got 7 years. Sarah remained at large. The protests continued, evolved, adapted, and something shifted in public consciousness. Not everyone became a resistor. Most people still preferred comfort to conflict, acceptance to activism. But enough people started questioning, doubting, demanding, that the monolithic certainty of the unified system began to fracture. I was 75 when the first official acknowledgments came. Not full apologies or complete reversals, but subtle shifts in language, quiet admissions that perhaps some histories had been oversimplified, that maybe some perspectives had been excluded for the sake of narrative clarity, that possibly some material should be made accessible for academic study. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even close to justice. But it was change, movement, the first visible cracks in a structure that had seemed permanent. Patricia didn't live to see it. She died 2 years earlier, at 89. Her final years spent writing a memoir that existed only in the network archives, a first-hand account of decades of quiet sabotage within the official system. Her funeral brought together 3 generations of resistors, people whose only common connection was that they'd known her, worked with her, learned from her. She planted seeds she never saw sprout, Margaret said in her eulogy. She fought battles that didn't have clear victories. She preserved evidence for trials that might never happen. And she did it all quietly, patiently, persistently, without recognition or reward or any guarantee that it mattered. That's what resistance looks like most of the time, not dramatic gestures or heroic sacrifices, but daily choices to do what's right, when it would be easier to do what's convenient. My own health started failing around the same time. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulated wear of 7 decades of life, of stress, of carrying weights that were never meant to be permanent. Elena cared for me with the same fierce love she'd always shown, supporting dangerous commitments while managing their consequences. Any regrets? She asked me one evening as we sat on our porch, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that had changed beyond recognition over our lifetimes. Hundreds, I admitted, but not about the work, not about the choice to remember instead of forget, to preserve instead of surrender. I regret mistakes, failures, people I couldn't protect, but I don't regret the commitment itself. Good, she said, squeezing my hand, because I don't regret supporting it, even when it terrified me, even when I wished you'd choose differently. You were right. That night we argued after the trials. Margaret needed to see that some things matter more than safety, that there are commitments worth sustaining even when they're dangerous. We sat in comfortable silence, 2 old people who'd fought a long, patient war that still wasn't quite won, but also wasn't quite lost. Somewhere, our children and grandchildren were continuing the work, adapting it, evolving it, making it their own. Thomas was released after 4 years of his sentence, part of a general amnesty meant to reduce tensions. He emerged changed, but not broken, still committed, but more careful, carrying forward the work with the wisdom of experience earned the hard way. The cascade he'd started had settled into something new, Not revolutionary transformation, but gradual erosion, steady pressure, persistent questioning. The unified system hadn't collapsed, but it had lost its absolute authority. Alternative narratives existed openly now, argued and debated and taught. The official history remained official, but it was no longer the only history. I died at 79. Elena beside me, my children and grandchildren gathered, my great-grandchildren too young to remember me but old enough to inherit the work. My last conscious thought was of my grandmother, standing in her kitchen that morning 42 years earlier, watching the flags come down and making the choice to preserve rather than surrender. I hoped I'd honored that choice, hoped I'd carried forward what she'd started, hoped the generations after me would continue the work, adapt it, keep it alive in whatever form the future required. My funeral was small, officially. A few dozen people gathered to mourn an elderly man who'd worked in archives and raised a family and lived a quiet life. But in the network, in the distributed systems and hidden communities that stretched across the continent, hundreds gathered virtually to mark the passing of someone who'd been part of something larger, who'd held the line, who'd kept faith. Margaret, my daughter, now in her 60s, took over the main family archive. The storage units, the cave, the accumulated evidence of decades. She promised to maintain them, expand them, ensure their preservation for whoever might need them next. But she also did something different. She began digitizing everything and distributing it widely, making it as close to public as safety allowed. Not everything at once, not recklessly, but systematically, carefully, ensuring that no single raid could destroy the collective memory we'd spent lifetimes building. Dad spent his life protecting these materials, she explained to anyone who questioned the decision. But protection isn't the ultimate goal. Use is. These archives need to work, need to inform, need to actually affect how people understand their world. Otherwise, we're just hoarders of information, not guardians of truth. The work continues. My granddaughter Margaret, named for my grandmother and my daughter, runs the technical infrastructure now. Thomas coordinates distribution. Sarah manages safe houses and support networks. My great-grandchildren are learning the skills they'll need to carry forward whatever version of this work their generation requires. The flags never came back. The unified system persists. The official history remains official. But underneath, around, despite it all, alternative histories thrive. Evidence persists. Memory survives. Questions multiply. Is it enough? I don't know. I never did. But it's what we could do, what we did do, what we're still doing. Preserving and distributing and teaching and remembering. Refusing to let everything be simplified, sanitized, controlled. Insisting that truth is complicated, that history is contested, that memory matters. The day they buried the flags, they thought they were ending something, a chapter of history, a mode of organization, a way of thinking about identity and sovereignty and collective meaning. But endings are also beginnings. The burial of the flags began our work of preservation. The erasure of history sparked our commitment to memory. The attempt to create a singular narrative generated distributed counter-narratives. They buried the flags. We exhumed them, archived them, distributed them, kept them alive in memory and evidence and stubborn refusal to forget. This is our testimony, not just mine, but the collective witness of generations who chose remembering over forgetting, who valued truth over convenience, who held on when letting go would have been easier. May these words find whoever needs them. May this evidence serve whoever seeks truth. May this memory outlast whatever powers try to erase it. The work continues, the archive grows, we remember. And we will keep remembering. For as long as memory requires guardians, for as long as truth needs witnesses, for as long as anyone refuses to accept that the official story is the complete story. This is who we were. This is what we did. This is what we preserved. May it be enough for the future we won't live to see. May it serve the people we'll never meet. May it justify the sacrifices of everyone who gave anything: time, safety, freedom, life. to ensure that some things weren't completely forgotten. The day they buried the flags marked the beginning of everything that followed. The resistance, the preservation, the networks, the generations of commitment, all of it flowing from that single morning when some people watched flags come down and decided not to let them disappear completely. My grandmother made that choice. I honored it. My children and grandchildren carry it forward, and someday someone will inherit it from them, will adapt it to whatever challenges their time presents, will find new ways to insist that memory matters, that truth persists, that resistance is possible. The work continues. It always continues. And that, finally, truly, is enough. Or is it? The question haunted my final years, and it haunts the network still. When is preservation enough? When does memory become merely historical curiosity rather than living resistance? At what point does stubborn commitment become simple stubbornness, disconnected from present relevance? These were the questions the third generation grappled with. My great-grandchildren's generation, born into a world where the unified system was the only system they'd ever known, where the transition was ancient history, where flags were curiosities from textbooks and archive photographs. They called their movement reclamation, not just preserving what had been lost, but actively working to restore elements of what had been taken. It started with symbols, people displaying historical flags not as acts of memory but as statements of identity, reclaiming visual language that had been suppressed for decades. The authorities didn't know how to respond. The symbols themselves weren't technically illegal. They'd been temporarily prohibited all those years ago, but the temporary prohibition had become permanent practice without ever becoming formal law. Prosecuting people for displaying historical flags would require acknowledging the prohibition, codifying it, making it official, which would raise all the questions they'd spent decades avoiding. So they tried softer approaches. Public service campaigns explaining why divisive symbols hindered unity. Educational programs teaching that historical flags represented problematic values. Social pressure encouraging forward-looking identities over nostalgic ones. It didn't work. Or rather, it worked on some people but made others more committed. Every campaign against the symbols made them more meaningful to those who displayed them. Every attempt to explain why flags were problematic just reminded people that flags had once meant something significant enough to ban. My great-grandson Alex, Thomas's son, became one of the leaders of reclamation. He was 27 when he organized the first Flag Day, a coordinated display of historical flags in public spaces across multiple cities. Thousands participated, hanging flags from windows, wearing them as clothing, painting them on walls. The authorities arrested him, of course, but the charge sheet was vague: public disturbance and symbolic provocation, rather than any specific violation. The trial became a referendum on memory itself. Did people have the right to display symbols of historical identity, or did social harmony require suppression of divisive imagery? The verdict split the judicial panel. 3 judges voted to convict, arguing that social stability sometimes required limitation of expression. 3 voted to acquit, arguing that historical symbols weren't inherently provocative and that people had rights to express cultural identity. The tie meant acquittal, but it also meant continued controversy. Flag Days became regular events. Not everyone participated. Many people genuinely preferred the unified system, saw historical identities as archaic and divisive, wanted to move forward rather than backward. But enough people participated that the displays couldn't be ignored or dismissed as fringe behavior. The movement spread to other symbols, other reclaimed practices. Regional languages that had been unified into standard dialects started appearing in public spaces. Historical holidays that had been replaced by unified celebrations were observed again. Local customs that had been standardized were revived. It wasn't restoration. The past couldn't be restored, couldn't be returned to. It was something new, something hybrid. People taking elements of historical identity and incorporating them into present life, not to recreate what had been, but to enrich what was. The network struggled with reclamation. Some members saw it as the natural evolution of preservation work. What was the point of preserving history if not to inform present and future. Others worried it was too visible, too provocative, too likely to trigger crackdowns that would destroy everything we'd built. I didn't live to see the debate resolved. But Elena did. She lived to 93, sharp and fierce until the end, watching her great-great-grandchildren carry forward work that had evolved far beyond what we'd imagined that morning when the flags came down. At her funeral, massive, public, attended by people from every level of the network, Margaret delivered a eulogy that captured something essential about the work and its evolution. "My mother-in-law spent her adult life supporting dangerous work," Margaret said, "supporting it not by doing it herself but by loving and sustaining the people who did it, by creating the stable foundation that made risky choices possible, by managing consequences and maintaining normalcy and ensuring that resistance didn't consume everything else that made life worth living." She understood something crucial. Resistance isn't sustainable if it's all-consuming. You can't fight every day without rest, without joy, without moments of ordinary life. The work needs to be part of life, not a replacement for it, and that requires people who can hold both, the commitment and the normalcy, the resistance and the rest. She raised children, maintained a career, kept a home, built community, and she did all of that while supporting a spouse who was involved in dangerous preservation work, while protecting a family that could have been destroyed by those commitments. She was the infrastructure that made the visible work possible. The archive remembers people like my father-in-law, like Patricia, like Sarah, like all the people who directly built and maintained the preservation network. But it should also remember people like Elena, who made the work sustainable, who ensured that resistance didn't require martyrdom, who showed that you could fight and also live, resist and also love, maintain commitments and also maintain humanity. The eulogy captured something the network had sometimes forgotten. Sustainability requires more than just operational security and distributed systems. It requires people who can maintain ordinary life alongside extraordinary commitment, who can hold space for both resistance and rest, who can ensure that the work serves life rather than consuming it. The fourth generation, Alex's children born 60 years after the flags came down, barely remembered a time when historical symbols were completely suppressed. They grew up with flag days, with regional languages, with hybrid identities that mixed historical elements with unified system realities. For them, reclamation wasn't a political act but simply part of cultural landscape. The network evolved accordingly. Less focus on preservation. That work had been largely successful. The archives were extensive and distributed and resilient. Less focus on distribution. Enough information was openly available that clandestine sharing was no longer necessary. More focus on interpretation, on helping people understand the significance of preserved materials, on connecting historical evidence to present questions. The archive my grandmother started in a cave past an old quarry had become a continental institution, not officially recognized but widely known, not legally sanctioned, but tacitly tolerated. Students did research there, journalists consulted it, families traced their histories through it. It had transformed from resistance infrastructure to cultural resource. Was this victory? Compromise? Evolution? All three, probably. The unified system persisted, still the official framework, still the dominant structure. But it had adapted, had incorporated some of what it had once tried to eliminate, had learned that absolute uniformity was neither achievable nor, perhaps, even desirable. The work continued, but its nature changed. Each generation took what the previous generation had built and adapted it to their needs, their challenges, their understanding of what mattered. Preservation became distribution, became reclamation, became interpretation, became something else entirely. Something the next generation would have to name and define. I think my grandmother would be proud of that evolution. She didn't want us to fight the same battles forever. She wanted us to preserve what mattered so that each generation could build on it, could take what was valuable and adapt it, could honor the past while creating something new. The flags never came back, not in the way they'd been, but elements of what they represented, identity, choice, memory, meaning, found new forms, new expressions, new relevance. The work of that morning, when some people chose to preserve rather than surrender, rippled forward through generations, changing form but maintaining core commitments. This is what resistance looks like across generations. Not a single movement with clear goals and definitive victories, but a continuous process of adaptation and evolution, of taking what matters and carrying it forward, of honoring sacrifices while making new choices, of remembering the past while building the future. The archive I inherited from my grandmother and passed to my daughter, and she to hers, now contains not just materials from the transition, but documents of everything that followed. The trials and crackdowns, the moments of hope and despair, the evolution of strategy, the changing nature of resistance. It's become a living record of how people respond when their world transforms, when their choices narrow, when their memories are challenged. Scholars study it now, not secretly but openly. Dissertations are written analyzing preservation strategies, comparing our network to historical resistance movements, understanding how distributed systems sustained commitment across generations. The work we did in secret has become public knowledge, transformed from resistance act to historical record. Is this what we wanted? I'm not sure we knew what we wanted beyond the immediate imperative to preserve what was being erased. But it's what we got. Transformation from active resistance to living archive, from clandestine network to cultural institution, from urgent preservation to patient education. The day they buried the flags marked a beginning we couldn't have imagined. Not just of preservation work, but of a long conversation across generations about memory and identity, about what matters enough to risk for, about how communities maintain continuity through change. That conversation continues, in archives and classrooms, in Flag Day displays and family stories, in the ways people choose to remember and honor and adapt what came before. The work never ends because culture never ends, because memory is always active, because each generation has to rediscover for themselves what's worth preserving and why. My grandmother started this work with letters burning in a sink and a flag hidden in a cave. 90 years later, her great-great-great-grandchildren continue it with digital archives and public displays and academic studies. The form has changed completely. The core commitment remains. We remember, we preserve, we adapt, we pass it on. That's the work. That's always been the work. And it will continue to be the work for however long humans care about connection to the past, about maintaining memory, about resisting the erasure of complexity and context and contradiction. The flags were just symbols. But what they symbolized, the possibility of chosen identity, the value of preserved memory, the importance of resistance to erasure that transcends any specific symbol. That's what we actually preserved, what we actually fought for, what we actually passed forward. The day they buried the flags, they tried to bury all of that. They failed. Not because we won some dramatic victory, but because we persisted through quiet commitment, through patient work, through stubborn refusal to accept that forgetting was inevitable. This is our testimony, our archive, our gift to the future. Use it well. Question it always. Adapt it constantly. But carry forward the core insight. Memory matters, truth persists, resistance is possible. The work continues. It always continues. And that, finally and truly and permanently, is enough. But let me tell you one more thing. One final memory before this testimony ends. It was a spring morning, 5 years before I died. I'd gone back to the cave past the old quarry, something I hadn't done in decades. The trail was harder to climb now. My knees complained. My breath came short. My body reminded me of its accumulated years. But I made it. And when I squeezed through that crack in the rock face, when I turned on my flashlight and saw what the cave had become, I wept. It was full. Not just with the boxes and materials we'd placed there generations ago, but with new contributions, recent additions, messages from people I'd never met, thanking anonymous preservers for keeping history alive, photographs from young people documenting their own times. ensuring their stories wouldn't be erased the way earlier stories had been. The cave had transcended our original purpose. It wasn't just our archive anymore. It had become a collective space, a place where anyone who understood its significance could add their piece, their testimony, their contribution to the ongoing record of what happened here and how people responded. I found a letter that day, tucked into one of the original boxes my grandmother had placed. It was in her handwriting, dated a year before she died, addressed to whoever continues this work. "If you're reading this," she wrote, "then you've kept faith. You've maintained what we started. You've refused to let everything be forgotten. Thank you for that. Thank you for carrying forward what your grandfather and I began, what August will continue, what his children and grandchildren will adapt and evolve. Don't let the work consume you. Don't let preservation become its own kind of prison. Remember that we do this to serve life, not to replace it. We preserve so that people can live fully, can know their history, can make informed choices. The archive is a tool, not a temple. Use it, share it, let it change. And remember, endings are also beginnings. When I'm gone, when August is gone, when everyone who remembers the transition is gone, the work doesn't end. It transforms. Each generation has to rediscover why memory matters, why truth persists, why resistance is necessary. Let them. Trust them. Give them the tools we built, but let them use those tools in their own ways. You're doing good work. Never doubt that, even when it seems pointless, even when no one notices, even when you wonder if it matters. It matters. You matter. This testimony matters. Keep going. Keep remembering. Keep passing it on. With love and hope and stubborn faith in the future, Margaret. I read that letter sitting on the cave floor, my flashlight creating shadows that danced across decades of accumulated evidence. And I understood something I'd been struggling toward my whole adult life. The work was never about the specific materials, the individual documents, the particular symbols. It was about the commitment itself, the choice to remember, the refusal to let complexity be simplified away. My grandmother knew she wouldn't see the end of this story. Neither would I. Neither would anyone. Because the story doesn't end. It continues, evolves, transforms into new stories that future generations will have to navigate and preserve and pass forward. That's what we built. Not a fixed archive, but a living tradition. Not a completed project, but an ongoing commitment. Not an answer, but a practice, a discipline, a way of engaging with history and memory and truth that each generation has to relearn and reaffirm for themselves. I climbed back down that day feeling lighter than I had in years. The weight I'd been carrying, the responsibility to preserve, to remember, to not fail my grandmother's trust, it was still there. But I understood it differently now. It wasn't a burden to bear alone, but a relay race, each generation running their leg before passing the baton forward. I've run my leg, I've carried what I could carry, preserved what I could preserve, passed forward what I could pass. Now it's someone else's turn, Margaret's turn, Thomas's turn, Alex's turn, and the turns of people I'll never meet who will continue this work in ways I can't imagine. This testimony is my baton pass. These words, this archive, this accumulated evidence, it's what I'm handing forward. Use it well. Question it constantly. Adapt it freely. But keep the core commitment alive. Remember, preserve, resist erasure. Pass it on. The day they buried the flags, they set in motion something they couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't stop. They created the conditions for exactly the kind of resistance they were trying to prevent. And that resistance, that refusal, that stubborn commitment to memory, it's still here, still growing, still evolving. So this is my final testimony. My last contribution to the archive my grandmother started 90 years ago. Read it, question it, build on it, and then write your own testimony, add your own evidence, make your own contribution to the ongoing conversation about what matters enough to preserve and why. The work continues. Always and forever, the work continues, and we continue it together, across generations and decades, and all the transformations still to come. That is enough. That has always been enough. That will always be enough.